The moment I saw that laminated private property sign floating down the river like a discarded, waterlogged piece of trash, I knew the battle lines hadn't oppos. T just been crossed, they'd been set on fire. My name is Wyatt Miller, and a few years back, I bought what I thought was my forever home, a rugged, beautiful stretch of land on the edge of Sleepy Valley in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. The crown jewel of the property was a deep, crystal-clear creek that carved a perfect horseshoe bend through the woods, and when I signed the deed, I made sure of one thing. I owned that water. It wasn't oppos, T community land, it wasn't oppos, T shared easement. It was mine, right down to the smooth river stones at the bottom. But in a neighborhood governed by an HOA president like Beatrice Thorne, a woman who carried a clipboard like a scepter and possessed the personality of a rusted bear trap, mine was always a subjective term. Beatrice was the kind of person who'd measure your grass with a ruler at 6 in the morning and send a certified letter if your mulch was the wrong shade of brown. But this latest stunt with the creek was a whole new level of audacity. I remember marching down to the bank that afternoon, fishing my sign out of the current, and finding a scene that looked like a country club had vomited on my backyard. There sat Beatrice, flanked by her 2 loyal lieutenants, Linda and Carol, lounging in expensive folding chairs with their fishing lines cast right into my favorite trout hole. They had a cooler full of white wine, a Bluetooth speaker thumping out smooth jazz, and an air of entitlement, so thick you could have cut it with a knife. When I cleared my throat, Beatrice didn't oppose, to even flinch. She just peered over the top of her oversized sunglasses, gave me a smile that was about as warm as a freezer burn, and told me they'd, voted last night to open the creek for, community enrichment, I told her right then and there that she was trespassing, that the deed in my safe said this was private land, and her response was a dismissive wave of the hand, as if I were a buzzing fly. Don and oppos, TB so provincial, Wyatt, she'd said, taking a sip of her wine, we've been enjoying this spot for weeks, and the neighborhood is much better for it, That weeks comment hit me like a physical blow, and instead of screaming, which is what my gut wanted to do, I just turned around and walked back to the house in total silence. You see, Beatrice didn't oppose. T know that I spent 10 years as a systems engineer, and my property wasn't oppose. T just guarded by signs. It was wired with a series of high-definition, thermal imaging cameras hidden so deep in the tree line you'd need a map to find them. I sat down at my kitchen table, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and pulled up the archive footage from the last month. What I saw on that screen didn't just make me angry, it made me go cold. It wasn't oppos, T just fishing. 3 weeks prior, I watched a video of Beatrice and 2 men from the architectural committee, Frank and Miller, dragging a literal chainsaw down to the water's edge. My heart sank as I watched them cut down a century-old willow tree, a tree I'd spent hours sitting under, just because it blocked their view of the sunset. They'd hauled in bags of industrial gravel to build a, path, installed a heavy-duty rope swing that was clearly a liability nightmare, and the footage showed at least a dozen different families using my land as a private park while I was away at work. This wasn't oppos, T just a neighborly misunderstanding anymore. This was organized vandalism and a blatant attempt to steal land through sheer arrogance. I didn't call Beatrice, and I didn't call the HOA board. Instead, I called a woman named Sarah Vance, a pit bull of a real estate attorney who once told me she enjoyed litigation more than most people enjoyed vacations. By the time the sun was setting, a deputy sheriff was standing in my kitchen, staring at the footage of the tree cutting with a grim look on his face. He told me that in Virginia, timber theft and criminal trespass on this scale weren't oppos. T just HOA squabbles they were serious offenses. I told him I wanted to press every single charge available, and as he walked back to his cruiser to file the report, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. But the real bomb didn't oppos. T drop until the next morning when Sarah called me back after doing a deep dive into the county's historical land records. Wyatt, she said, her voice crackling with a sort of dark amusement, end quote. You're going to want to sit down for this. I pulled the original subdivision plat from 30 years ago. Your lot, along with the 3 adjacent to the creek, was never actually incorporated into the HOA and OPPO's legal boundaries. The developer sold them as an OPPO's, unrestricted in OPPO's, parcels to attract higher-end buyers, end quote. My jaw practically hit the floor as the realization washed over me. For 3 years, I had been paying, end quote, dues, end quote, to a group that had no legal authority over me, and Beatrice had been sending me, end quote, fines, end quote, for a mailbox that wasn't in OPPO's, even under her jurisdiction. They weren't in OPPO's, just trespassing on my land. They were running a fraudulent racket on the entire edge of the neighborhood. Armed with this, I didn't in OPPO's go to the next HOA meeting. I sent Sarah in my place, equipped with a stack of folders that were essentially legal hand grenades. She handed them out to every board member. The photos of the cut tree, the invoices for the gravel, the criminal trespass citations, and the crowning glory, the proof that they had zero jurisdiction over my home. According to Sarah, Beatrice turned a shade of purple that was almost artistic before trying to claim that, end quote, customary use, end quote, gave them the right to the water. It didn't in OPPO's. The fallout was a beautiful, chaotic mess. Within 48 hours, the 2 men who helped cut the tree resigned in a panic, and the neighborhood grapevine exploded. People I'd never spoken to, like a retired nurse named Martha, who'd been fined thousands for her, end quote, non-compliant, end quote, flower beds, started showing up at my door with pies and stories of their own. But Beatrice Thorne wasn't in OPPO's, the type to go down without a fight. A week later, I saw a white SUV idling at the edge of my driveway, a man inside taking long-lens photos of my house and the creek. It was a classic intimidation tactic, end quote, zoning review, end quote, attempt to find some obscure environmental violation to shut me down. But Beatrice's desperation made her sloppy. She had filed a request with the county for end quote, recreational reassessment, end quote, of my lot, claiming I had built end quote, permanent structure, end quote, on a protected waterway. When the county inspector showed up, he was in OPPO's, looking at me. He was looking at the coordinates Beatrice provided, and those coordinates led him straight to a massive wooden observation deck that had been built just south of my line on what was supposed to be protected county wetlands. It turns out Beatrice and her inner circle had in OPPO's just been messing with me. They had been using HOA funds, my, end quote, dues, end quote, included, to build a private clubhouse on public land they didn't in OPPO's own, and they had forged my parcel number on the permit applications to make it look like it was part of my, end quote, unauthorized, end quote, development. They try to frame me for their illegal construction project. But the county doesn't and OPPO's take kindly to having its wetlands paved over. When the inspector realized the permits were fraudulent, the situation shifted from a civil dispute to a criminal conspiracy. I watched from my porch as 3 different state agencies descended on that deck. They found emails where Beatrice openly discussed, end quote, absorbing, end quote, my land by making it too expensive for me to fight back. The end came fast, and it was brutal. Beatrice was arrested at her home on charges of fraud, embezzlement of HOA funds, and falsifying government documents. It turned out she'd been skimming off the top of the, end quote, maintenance fund, end quote, for years to pay for her own landscaping and a series of, end quote, consulting fees, end quote, that went straight to her cousin's shell company. The HOA itself was essentially bankrupt, its reputation in tatters. At the final hearing, a judge ordered the total dissolution of the HOA's current charter, and for the first time in a decade, the neighborhood was free. No more rulers in the grass, no more, end quote, approved, end quote, shades of beige, just a group of neighbors finally talking to each other instead of reporting each other. I spent the following Saturday down at the creek, planting a new sapling where the old willow used to stand. The water was quiet again, the smooth jazz replaced by the sound of the current over the rocks and the occasional call of a red-tailed hawk. Martha from down the street walked by with her dog and gave me a wave, no longer worried about being timed on her walk. I stood there for a long time, looking at that horseshoe bend, thinking about how easily people with a little bit of power can convince themselves they own the world. It took a lot of noise and a lot of legal paperwork to get back to this silence. But as I sat on the bank with a cold beer, watching the water roll by, I knew it was worth every penny and every sleepless night. But now, looking at the empty lot where Beatrice's house used to be before she had to sell it to pay her legal fees, I cannot help but wonder if this is really the end. The new neighborhood committee is, in quote, voluntary, in quote, for now, but I've started seeing a few familiar faces hovering near the property lines with clipboards again, talking about, in quote, standards, in quote, and, in quote, uniformity, in quote. It makes me think that maybe some people just can't breathe unless they're telling someone else how to live. So, I've kept the cameras running, and I've kept my lawyer's number on speed dial. Because the thing about boundaries is that they only work if you and oppos are willing to stand on the line and hold it. What would you have done if you found out your entire neighborhood and oppos authority was a lie? Would you have kept quiet just to keep the peace? Or would you have burned the whole system down to save your trees? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to see where you draw the line.